Marcus Kane sat motionless in the Galactic Empire's grand throne room, shackled and flanked by Imperial guards. The Emperor lounged lazily on his massive throne, a garish symbol of wealth and power, as he addressed the human diplomat before him. Kane had been sent by Earth to broker peace, to ensure that humanity's future would be secured under the vast, oppressive thumb of the Galactic Empire. But the Emperor, dismissive of humanity's ability to challenge his rule, had far different plans. This was not a negotiation. This was an opportunity for the Empire to prove its dominance, an opportunity to humiliate Earth's representative. The Emperor's voice echoed through the hall, laced with mockery. "So, this is the great diplomat from Earth. What, pray tell, can your pitiful species offer us? Peace? The notion of Earth being a threat is laughable. You are nothing more than a mosquito, easily swatted." Kane's eyes remained steady, not reacting to the insult. He had been trained for moments like this. His mind was already elsewhere, calculating, assessing, preparing. Behind the calm demeanor was a man who had once been known as Phantom, an assassin of legend. But that man had died years ago, buried under the weight of his past decisions, his efforts to bring peace to a fractured world. Now, he was Marcus Kane, a diplomat sent to avoid war, to secure humanity's survival, no matter the cost. As the Emperor continued his tirade, Kane's thoughts focused on the details, the guards' postures, the subtle shifts in the architecture, the paths they would likely take when they moved to imprison him. Kane's gaze never left the Emperor, but his mind mapped out every potential exit, every weakness in the heavily fortified room. He knew this would not be a simple negotiation. There would be no words to sway this Emperor. Only action would speak loud enough. "You should have just let me talk." Kane's voice was cold, a quiet statement that hung in the air. His words were almost an afterthought to the Emperor, but they dripped with the kind of quiet menace that had once made him feared across the galaxy. It was the calm before the storm, the unmistakable certainty that Kane was no mere diplomat, that he had faced much worse than this pompous Emperor in his time. The Emperor chuckled darkly, not even comprehending the weight of the statement. "Talk? What could you possibly say that would interest me, human? Your species is insignificant. Your history? Irrelevant." At that moment, Kane allowed himself a brief flash of emotion, one only a select few would ever see, the faintest glimmer of disdain. The Emperor had underestimated him in the worst way. This man, this self-important fool sitting on his throne, thought he was in control. But Kane knew differently. The most dangerous thing the Emperor could do was assume that he could predict the human diplomat's next move. The guards at Kane's sides tightened their grip on his shackles. Kane felt the pressure of their hands, the cold metal biting into his skin, but it did not faze him. They thought they held him captive. They thought they could break him. What they didn't realize was that Kane had spent his life living in the shadows, walking the line between life and death, mastering the art of survival in ways they could never imagine. They didn't know what kind of man they were dealing with. As the Emperor droned on about the futile nature of human existence, Kane's mind whirred with purpose. He studied the smallest details, the way the guards shifted their weight, the faintest clicks in the palace's infrastructure that hinted at a network of tunnels just beneath the surface, the glimmer of the Emperor's arrogance as he basked in his perceived superiority. Everything had a purpose. Everything had a weakness. Meanwhile, Kane's presence was doing something unexpected. It was starting to unnerve the Emperor. The Emperor, who had easily crushed rebellions and enslaved entire civilizations, found himself at a loss in the face of this calm, unflinching human. It was a discomfort he couldn't understand, an unfamiliar fear creeping in. He turned his gaze to his subordinates, who avoided his eyes, and for a split second, the Emperor's expression faltered. But Kane remained unmoved. It wasn't fear that would defeat the Empire. It wasn't diplomacy either. It was the cold, calculated precision of a man who had once lived in the shadows, who had made war a silent art. In that moment, Kane's true power wasn't in his words but in his ability to wait, to let the tension build until the perfect moment arrived. The Emperor's laughter filled the room, but it lacked conviction now. Kane's silence was louder than any words, louder than the Emperor's mockery. The tension in the air thickened, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire, ready to snap. Cain had already won this part of the battle. His stillness, his utter refusal to play by the Emperor's rules, had already begun to erode the Emperor's confidence. As the Emperor continued to belittle him, Cain allowed his eyes to flicker briefly toward the exit. Just a fraction of a second, just enough to memorize the patterns of movement in the guards outside, the placement of the surveillance equipment in the corners of the room, and the faintest hint of a structural flaw near the back wall. Every detail mattered. Every second was precious. Finally, the Emperor paused, his mocking expression faltering for just a moment. Cain had done it. He had planted the seed of doubt in the Emperor's mind. In the face of arrogance, Cain had simply waited. And that, more than anything, was enough to unsettle the Emperor. The Empire's greatest weapon was its overconfidence. Cain, a diplomat, was not supposed to have this effect on such a powerful ruler. He wasn't supposed to be someone who could make the Emperor question his authority in a single, quiet moment. But it was too late. Cain's response had already set the stage for what was to come. The calm before the storm was now over. The Emperor might have dismissed him, but Cain knew what came next. He had been in situations like this before. He had been the one underestimated, the one whose quiet demeanor had been mistaken for weakness. But now, as he stood before the Emperor, shackled but unbroken, Cain knew that he was about to turn the tables. The first move would be his. And the Empire would regret ever underestimating him. Cain's mind was already in motion the moment the Emperor's mockery faded into the background. It wasn't just the insult, it was the opportunity it represented. He had been planning for this moment since his arrival. Each word, each movement was calculated. The Empire had assumed they could simply detain him, force him to reveal Earth's secrets, and use him as leverage. They didn't realize that Marcus Cain was far more than a diplomat. He had been an assassin, a master strategist, and now, they had made the mistake of underestimating him. As the guards approached, tightening their grip on Cain's shackles, his body tensed with controlled energy. They had no idea what they were dealing with. His pulse remained steady, his breathing calm, but inside, his mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, each more deadly than the last. He had already memorized the layout of the room, the movements of the guards, the weaknesses in the fortress-like structure of the palace. Every minute spent in this hall had been spent plotting his escape. This wasn't the first time he had been imprisoned, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. The guards' hands were cold and rough as they yanked his chains, trying to force him to kneel. Cain's response was a silent acknowledgement of their arrogance. They believed their size and strength would dominate him, that their power would subjugate a mere human. But they had failed to recognize the most important truth: Cain was not a prisoner. He was a predator. He allowed them to think they had control for a few moments longer, all while he analyzed every detail. The shackles were tight, but the material wasn't unbreakable. The guards, though armed, were predictable. There were gaps in their security, gaps that would soon be his escape route. But first, he needed to bide his time. The right moment had not yet arrived. The Emperor, meanwhile, seemed content to gloat. He addressed his subordinates with a self-satisfied grin, taking every opportunity to flaunt his supposed superiority. Cain, however, remained unmoving. He knew the Emperor's overconfidence was a weakness. The more the Emperor spoke, the more he revealed his arrogance. He was too focused on his own power, too blinded by it to notice the subtle shifts in the air around him. Cain had already seen enough to know that, when the time came, the Emperor would not be prepared for the storm that was coming. A soft shift in the air. Cain's eyes flickered ever so slightly to the guard standing closest to him. A subtle movement, just a glance, but it was enough to confirm what he had been waiting for. The guard's attention wavered. The tiniest crack in the armor. The moment Cain had anticipated. In that instant, Cain's body moved faster than anyone could react. The chain around his wrist snapped with a simple but calculated motion, an impossibly swift strike that caught the guard off guard. Before the other guards could respond, Cain had already wrenched himself free, the cold steel of the chains now his weapon. He used their momentum, their overconfidence, against them, striking with the precision of a seasoned fighter. The first guard fell, but Kane didn't pause to watch. His mind was already calculating the next steps, moving toward his goal, escape. The guards scrambled to respond, but it was already too late. Kane's movements were too fast, too precise. They reached for their weapons, but he was already on them, using his chains to disarm one, his foot to kick another away. His strikes were a blur of calculated violence. In moments, the entire room had descended into chaos, but Kane was still calm, still focused. He moved with the fluidity of someone who had honed their craft for decades, who had learned to blend his mind and body into one lethal weapon. Each move was an expression of calculated brilliance, designed not just to overpower but to incapacitate. It wasn't about brute force, it was about efficiency. The guards were no match for him. They had underestimated him, and now they were paying the price. But even as he fought, Kane's mind remained fixed on the larger picture. His escape wasn't just about breaking free, it was about sending a message. The Empire had humiliated Earth, thinking it could crush the human spirit with a show of force. But they had forgotten that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't its armies, it was its people. And Marcus Kane was the embodiment of that strength. With the last guard on the ground, Kane took a breath, feeling the rush of victory that came not from the fight but from the satisfaction of regaining control. He moved toward the door, his steps measured and deliberate. His escape was not just an act of survival, it was a declaration. The Empire might have captured him, but they would not keep him. As Kane moved through the palace's corridors, his mind shifted once more to his next objective. The escape had gone as planned, but this was just the beginning. He needed information. The Emperor's palace was an enigma of secrets, a labyrinth of power that held the key to dismantling the Empire's rule. Kane knew that to truly make an impact, he needed to strike at the heart of the Empire's leadership, to destabilize their grip on the galaxy. But even as he moved with purpose, Kane couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. He had expected resistance, yes, but what he hadn't anticipated was the growing unrest among the Empire's subjects. Whispers began to reach him from the shadows of the corridors, from those who watched his every move with a mixture of awe and fear. The faintest murmur of rebellion was growing louder. It was not just the human diplomat who had the power to topple the Empire, it was the collective will of the oppressed. Kane's mind turned, and for the first time, he allowed himself to consider an alliance. The Empire was not just a machine of war, it was a structure built on fear and oppression, a system that had kept entire species subjugated for centuries. Kane had always worked alone, but now, in the heart of the Empire, he could sense that something greater was stirring, a resistance that could take down the Empire if it had the right spark. The question was no longer just about survival, it was about purpose. Did he simply escape, leaving the Empire to its own devices? Or could he use his newfound position to ignite a revolution, to inspire the oppressed to rise against their captors? Kane had spent so long walking the path of vengeance that he hadn't considered the possibility of something greater. But as he moved through the corridors, a figure stepped into his path, a woman, sharp-eyed and determined. Lyra Shane, leader of a covert resistance faction, her mind as sharp as her blade. "You're the diplomat," she said, her voice steady but tinged with suspicion. "The one who's been making waves across the Empire." Her eyes scanned him, noting his disheveled appearance, the chains still hanging from his wrist. "You've got something the Empire didn't count on. But you're not the only one who's been waiting for a moment like this." Kane met her gaze. It was the moment of decision. He could walk away, continue his path alone, or he could take the first step towards something more. He didn't know if he could trust Lyra, but in that moment, he realized that his goals might not be so different from hers. "I'm not here to join a rebellion," Kane said coldly, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in the shadows. "I'm here to destroy an empire." Her gaze never faltered. "Then let's make it happen." The deal was struck in silence, the unspoken understanding between them forming a tenuous alliance. Kane might not have fully trusted Lyra, but he recognized her as someone who understood the stakes. Together they could begin the work of dismantling the Empire's reign of terror, one strategic strike at a time. The hunt began almost immediately. The Empire's response was swift and brutal, but Kane had anticipated it. They had underestimated him once, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. He was already 3 steps ahead. Kane knew the Empire would deploy its elite forces, the Shadow Legion, to track him down, an unstoppable force of merciless soldiers, trained in the art of assassination, stealth, and psychological warfare. Kane had fought such soldiers before, but this time, the stakes were higher. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for something more, something far more dangerous, the possibility of changing the galaxy forever. Lyra Shane had already proven herself an invaluable ally, despite her initial hesitation. She was resourceful, quick-witted, and fiercely committed to the rebellion's cause. Their alliance, however reluctant, had begun to forge a new path forward. Lyra was driven by the need to liberate the oppressed species across the galaxy, and Kane found himself drawn to the idea of seeing the Empire fall. But his motivations were still deeply personal. The vengeance that had led him here still burned, and as much as he hated to admit it, Lyra's passion for a broader cause had begun to tug at something deep within him. It was a feeling he had buried long ago. The Shadow Legion's search for Kane began with cold efficiency. They moved quickly, silently, through the vast network of the Empire's Imperial facilities. Their goal was simple: find Kane, capture him, and end the threat he posed to their master's reign. Kane, however, wasn't easy to catch. He had already laid the groundwork for his escape, mapping out the hidden tunnels beneath the Empire's fortress-like structure, scouting for weaknesses in their defenses, and recruiting willing allies from the shadows. Kane knew that the Empire's strength lay in its sheer might and its ability to crush any opposition. But he also knew that their biggest weakness was their arrogance. They believed they were invincible, that no one could threaten their power. Kane was about to prove them wrong. As the Shadow Legion closed in, Kane and Lyra had already begun their series of hit-and-run missions, targeting key Imperial assets across the Empire. The strategy was simple but effective: strike fast, leave no trace, and disappear before reinforcements could arrive. It was a game of cat and mouse, with Kane always one step ahead. The Shadow Legion, relentless and efficient as they were, had never faced an opponent like Kane. He wasn't just an assassin. He was a strategist, a master of manipulating the environment to his advantage. He used the Empire's own strengths against them, drawing them into ambushes, sabotaging their communications, and leaving them scrambling to maintain control. Lyra, with her deep knowledge of the Empire's inner workings, proved to be an essential asset. Her quick thinking and ability to rally support from other oppressed alien species allowed them to strike where the Empire was weakest. Kane, however, wasn't as easily swayed by the idea of a rebellion. He had no interest in rallying the masses. His focus remained on the immediate threat. But with every successful mission, with every Empire asset destroyed, something in him began to change. He could feel the momentum shifting. Lyra's belief in the rebellion, her unwavering resolve, was contagious. Slowly, he found himself questioning his solitary path. Was it really enough to destroy the Empire? Or was there something more to be gained by working with Lyra and her allies, something that could bring lasting change to the galaxy? Their missions grew bolder as the Shadow Legion intensified their efforts. The elite soldiers were relentless, tracking them across every corner of the galaxy. But Kane and Lyra were no novices. They knew how to disappear, how to leave no trace, and they used the Empire's overconfidence against them. It was a game of patience and precision. For every move the Empire made, Kane countered with one of his own. He used every opportunity to destabilize their operations, exploiting every crack in their seemingly invincible facade. The hunt was relentless, but so was Kane. The closer the Legion got, the more brutal their methods became. The once unfamiliar faces of the alien resistance groups now became familiar to Kane. Each victory brought more resistance fighters into their fold, more allies who were ready to take up the fight against the Empire. But as the Empire's forces closed in, the pressure mounted. Kane knew that time was running out. He had to strike before they were cornered, before the full force of the Shadow Legion was unleashed. His plan was simple but dangerous: take the fight to the heart of the Empire. In the midst of the escalating hunt, Kane began to have flashbacks to his previous life, memories of his time as Phantom, the deadly assassin who had once brought entire governments to their knees. The weight of his past was a burden he couldn't shake, a shadow that hung over every decision he made. It was the reason he had retired from the life of killing, the reason he had chosen diplomacy as a means of redemption. But now, in the face of the Empire's tyranny, the assassin within him was slowly reawakening. The violence that had once been his way of life began to feel like a necessary evil in a galaxy ruled by cruelty. Kane understood better than anyone that peace could only be brokered through strength, and sometimes that meant using the sharp edge of a blade. As he and Lyra prepared for another mission, Kane's thoughts turned inward. His detachment had always been his shield, his way of protecting himself from the horrors of his past. But the deeper he delved into the rebellion's cause, the more he saw the potential for something greater than just revenge. The rebel forces were beginning to grow, their message spreading like wildfire across the galaxy. With every successful strike, the Empire's grip weakened. But Kane knew that to truly end the Empire's reign, he had to take the fight to the heart of the beast. He couldn't rely solely on guerrilla tactics or hit-and-run raids. The final blow had to come from within. Lyra, ever the idealist, saw the potential in Kane's ruthlessness. She had always believed in the power of unity, in the strength of collective action. But she also saw that Kane was more than just a weapon of destruction. He was a symbol, one that could rally the oppressed across the galaxy. And while Kane wasn't ready to embrace her vision fully, he couldn't deny that there was something about the way she fought for her people that resonated with him. The pressure from the Empire was mounting, and the final confrontation was inevitable. Kane knew that the Shadow Legion would soon catch up to them. It was only a matter of time before the Empire's elite forces converged on their location. But Kane wasn't afraid. He had faced death countless times, and now, he was ready to face the Empire head-on. The time for running was over. Kane would make his stand, and this time, he wouldn't be alone. As the Shadow Legion prepared for their final assault, Kane and Lyra gathered their forces. The war for the galaxy's future was about to begin, and Kane knew that every move he made from here on out would have lasting consequences. The Empire had underestimated him once, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. This time, the hunt would end with the Empire's downfall, or his death. But either way, Kane was ready. He would either break the Empire's grip or die trying. The battle between Marcus Kane and the Galactic Empire had escalated to a point of no return. His actions had already set off a chain reaction that the Empire had been scrambling to contain. The Emperor, now fully aware of Kane's lethal capabilities, had become obsessed with eliminating him. But Kane was no ordinary adversary. He wasn't just a diplomat, he was a force of nature, an agent of destruction who had been honed by years of fighting in the shadows. And as the Empire's forces bore down on him, Kane was about to make his final move. Lyra Shane, ever the strategist, knew that the time for subtlety had passed. The Empire's grasp on the galaxy had weakened, but it hadn't broken yet. She had rallied a large faction of resistance fighters, but their power was still scattered, their efforts disjointed. To truly take down the Empire, to ignite a full-scale revolution, they needed to strike at the heart of the beast. The Emperor's palace was the symbol of the Empire's power, its heart beating at the center of everything. It was time to bring the fight to him. Kane, however, was a man driven by vengeance. He had already come this far, and the thought of letting the Emperor go unpunished was intolerable. His mission had been clear from the beginning: destroy the Empire's leadership, destabilize their control, and send a message to the galaxy. But now, with every passing day, something had changed within him. His quest for revenge was no longer the sole motivator. Kane had begun to see the larger picture. His actions, his strikes against the Empire, had ignited a spark in the oppressed people of the galaxy. The rebels, the oppressed, the downtrodden, Kane had become the symbol of their resistance, the embodiment of their hope. He hadn't set out to be a leader, but fate had other plans. The Emperor, desperate to maintain control, had resorted to desperate measures. He had unleashed his most powerful weapon, a massive, planet-destroying superweapon capable of wiping out entire civilizations in the blink of an eye. Earth, Kane's home, was the primary target. It was a brutal move, one that showed just how far the Empire was willing to go to preserve its dominion. But it was also the Empire's fatal mistake. Kane wasn't just going to let it happen. He had to stop the weapon before it was too late, and in doing so, he would face the Emperor one final time. Kane's mind raced as he moved through the halls of the Imperial Palace, his every step calculated, his every move deliberate. The Emperor's palace was a fortress, its security measures nearly impenetrable. But Kane had spent the last few days gathering intel, learning the layout, and preparing for this final assault. He knew the risks. He had faced death more times than he cared to count. But this time, it wasn't just his life at stake. The future of humanity, the fate of countless civilizations, hung in the balance. As Kane and Lyra led their ragtag team of rebels through the palace, they faced obstacles at every turn. Imperial guards, automated security systems, and elite soldiers stood between them and their objective. But Kane was relentless. He cut through the opposition with ruthless efficiency, his movements swift and precise. Every encounter was an opportunity to prove his superiority, to remind the Empire that they had made a grave mistake underestimating him. With every fight, the resistance grew stronger, the rebels more emboldened. Kane's presence, his sheer force of will, had turned the tide in their favor. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting for freedom. The deeper they went into the palace, the more intense the resistance became. The Emperor, desperate to maintain control, had sent his best soldiers to stop them. The Shadow Legion, the elite of the elite, was on their tail. They were closing in, their strategy cold and calculated. They knew Kane's tactics, his methods, and they were prepared to bring him down. But Kane had one advantage they didn't: his mind. He had spent years thinking 3 steps ahead, always planning, always adapting. The Shadow Legion might be the best trained soldiers in the galaxy, but they didn't have the advantage of being 1 step ahead of their opponent. Lyra, ever the optimist, pushed the team forward. Her belief in the cause, in the idea of a galaxy free from the Empire's tyranny, was infectious. She had come to rely on Kane, not just for his skill, but for his leadership. She had always known that the fight for freedom was never going to be easy, but with Kane by her side, it felt like the impossible could be achieved. Yet even she couldn't ignore the growing tension between their goals. Kane's mind was focused solely on vengeance, on the need to destroy the Emperor, while Lyra saw a broader vision. She wanted to see the Empire toppled, but she also wanted to see a new galaxy rise from its ashes, a galaxy where the oppressed were no longer held captive by fear. The Emperor, meanwhile, had not been idle. He had anticipated this attack and was preparing for his final confrontation with Kane. He had fortified his palace, drawn all his forces into the heart of his empire, and activated his superweapon. Earth's destruction was imminent, but the Emperor didn't know that Kane had already infiltrated his inner sanctum. The game had changed. Kane wasn't just another soldier to be killed, he was the storm that would bring the Empire to its knees. As Kane made his way into the Emperor's private chambers, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. This was it, the final showdown. The Empire had no idea what was coming. Kane had already mapped out his victory. Every move had been calculated. Every obstacle accounted for. The Emperor would fall today, and with him, the Empire would crumble. Inside the Emperor's chamber, Kane found him waiting. The Emperor, once so confident, now looked desperate. The time for negotiation was over. Kane's presence was an unmistakable signal that the end had come. The Emperor's smug smile faltered as he realized just how close he was to losing everything. His superweapon was nearly operational, but Kane wasn't worried. He knew that the Emperor's pride had blinded him to the truth. Kane had already disabled the weapon, rendering it useless. The Emperor's power, like his reign, was a mirage, a fragile illusion that Kane had shattered with a single blow. The final confrontation was brutal. Kane and the Emperor exchanged words, but there was no real negotiation. The Emperor offered Kane a deal, abandon the rebellion, and Earth would be spared. But Kane's answer was simple, final, and cold. I'm not here to bargain. In the end, Kane did what he had always done best. He fought with precision and brutality. The Emperor's personal guards stood between him and his goal, but they were no match for Kane's calculated strikes. One by one they fell, until the Emperor was the last one standing. The moment had come. Kane walked toward him, his steps measured and purposeful. The Emperor, now stripped of his power, looked at Kane with a mixture of fear and disbelief. You don't have to do this, the Emperor pleaded. Kane's response was simple, and it was final. It's too late for that. With a single, lethal strike, Kane ended the Emperor's reign. The Galactic Empire, once a powerful force that spanned the galaxy, had crumbled. But the war was far from over. Lyra and the Resistance seized the moment, rallying the oppressed species and igniting the revolution. Kane, however, knew his time had come to an end. His mission was complete. The Empire was gone, and the galaxy had a chance at freedom. Kane didn't need to stay. He had done what he set out to do. As he left the palace behind, Kane's name would live on as a symbol, not just of vengeance, but of hope. The universe had underestimated humanity once. They wouldn't make that mistake again.